we go. Good evening. And that first clip that you saw, probably for many of you, that was your first introduction, to the Beatles and the way things were going to be. That wasn't my first introduction to them, so I'm going to just take you back a long time ago in 1963, in the summer of '63. My older brother and I used to always be playing this hockey game. Back in the old days, before they had computers, you had these hockey games and the levers go back and forth. You remember that? And you'd get that little puck and you'd lose that in the first week, so you'd have marbles. You'd use the marbles to do it. Anyway, we used to be playing that game in the basement, and we always had the radio on. My brother was 7 years older than me, and he was sort of into the pop music at the time. I wasn't quite there yet, so. But we'd be listening to the radio, and on the radio this one day in the summer of '63, I heard this sound, and it was, the singers were singing with a lot of force and energy, and there was a vibrancy in the music. And my brother said, "That's the Beatles. They're from England, and they're really big over there." So a few days later, I'm visiting a friend of mine up the street whose parents happened to be English, and they used to get delivered to their door, in the mail. They used to get the odd paper, the daily paper from England. And I was just flipping through it, and it showed this picture of a bunch of policemen sort of all locked in arms, and in behind them were all these girls and crowd screaming. And, it was talking about the Beatles, so that, gee, there it is. It's come up twice in the last few days. So it really piqued my interest. Probably because there was a bunch of girls screaming. Might have been it. Anyway, what happened is that in Canada, we came upon the Beatles much earlier than they did in the United States. Because in Canada, the person running Capitol Records Canada was promoting these records and getting them out on the market well before they were in the United States. In the United States, they were trying to get those records in the United States, but they kept getting blocked by the artist repertoire person in the United States, and they weren't being released down there. But up here in Canada, we knew a good thing, and so we had those records released. So songs like "Please Please Me," "From Me to You," "She Loves You," they were all out in Canada, but they hadn't even been released in the States, really. So there I was with this, this real interest before they ever made it on the Ed Sullivan Show. And I remember it used to be a magazine, it probably still exists, called Life magazine, American magazine. And in their November issue, they had this little section, one-page thing called Names in the News. And they had a little picture of the Beatles. They were meeting royalty or something, and were shaking hands or bowing or whatever it was that they were doing. So that was sort of the first American publicity, was November of '63. Now what's happened is that for me, it's been the Beatles have given me sort of a lifetime of joy, and certainly spurred my interest in music. It's not the only thing I'm interested in, but it certainly is a major part of what I'm interested in. And the guys can tell you that it doesn't matter what conversation we're having, I can always bring it back to the Beatles. I can always bring it back to them. So whether we went on and went to the dark side and became big fans of the Rolling Stones, the dark side over here, or we progressed and became, a horn player in a horn band over here, we certainly realized that something major did happen for us that many years ago, 50-some years ago. And we're still amazed, at what the Beatles were able to accomplish, certainly recording-wise, in a very short period of time, an 8-year period. So we decided what we wanted to do. We've been in a band, the Saltwater Roses band, for a number of years. I can't remember the exact number, but about 30 years or more. And during that time, we've played a number of Beatles songs, along with various other songs as well. But what we decided to do was we sort of put out this email to the 4 members and said, pick 10 songs that you'd like to do by the Beatles. And so each member sort of individually then sort of picked the 10 songs, and then we got together, and some of them were repeats, and some of them we discarded because we couldn't play them. But, or sing them. More about the singing later. Yeah. So anyway, we whittled it down into a number of songs, and that's what we're going to do tonight. So we're going to go on a little journey in the past here from 1962 to 1970. And we're going to try to do that in roughly chronological order. So we'll start with sort of their early albums and then move through, for the most part. One of the interesting things when we picked our songs, we didn't pick any of their hits, strangely enough. So if you came tonight thinking you were going to get a repeat of the Beatles' one album, that ain't going to happen. There are a few songs which were, I guess we can consider them, they were on the singles, but they weren't the A side of the singles. But along the way, we realized we needed some help. Not enough fingers, or maybe much less skill than we thought we had. So we were going to call on some others to help us out this evening. So with, as the Beatles say, with a little help from our friends. So Peter back here is going to be helping us out in both sets with added percussion. So thank you, Peter. And these guys behind me are also in another band, and there's two other members from that band called Dublin Road. And Steve Roberts and John Thompson are going to be joining us partway through the first set, and they're going to do a couple of Beatles songs as well. So thank you, guys. And another member of Saltwater Roses, Steve Brown, is with us tonight, and he's sort of the guitarist extraordinaire. So he's going to be joining us in the second set for a number of tunes as well. So thank you, Steve, for coming out. So what we're going to do is we're going to play for a while. We'll have an intermission, and during that time you can get a chance to get a drink and chat. And so sit back, relax, and feel free to give us a little encouragement. As you know, the Beatles started out not making records. In 1957, John meets Paul. They were part of the Quarrymen at that time when Paul joins, and then they realized right away that neither one of them was a great lead guitarist. So they asked little George Harrison to join up, and George was a year and a half younger than Paul at the time, and he remained that way for the rest of his life. They were clearly a cover band in those early years, even though Paul and John, even before they met, they were actually writing songs. But then once they got together, they were writing songs individually and together. So they were basically a cover band, much like we're going to be tonight. And they went off to Hamburg in 1960, where they sort of honed their craft. They were playing roughly 8 hours a night, 7 days a week for a 3-month period, the first time that they went. They grew up in Hamburg. And so during that time, their repertoire, expanded greatly. So they were doing all kinds of musical styles, and that really does show through their whole career, the variety of styles that they had. Along the way, they got an audition in very early 1962 with Decca Records, the famous Decca Records. And Decca Records turned them down. They turned them down. And so it took a little while for their manager, Brian Epstein, to get them another chance at a recording contract, which they managed to get with EMI. But there was a problem. The producer at the time, and their producer through their career, George Martin, didn't like the drumming very much. So what he did was he basically told them that, and that was the impetus for the Beatles to change drummers. And that's where Richard Starkey, Ringo Starr, joins the band. And of course, once that part came there, then you had the sound, you had the style, and they already had the humor, in order to put that all together in a very unique package that no one really had seen before. As somebody said, it looked like they came from outer space, and they were so different from what we were used to. So on their very first album, George Martin, the producer, they had a few singles, and then what happened is that George Martin says, let's make an LP, a long player. So what happens is that he says, why don't we just record you live? You've got your stage act already. Let's just get in the studio and record the song. So they actually record the whole album in one day. Now that might not impress you, but it impresses me because to be able to do that all in one day, very unusual. And they just kept running through songs, eventually finding the 12 or 14 that were on that very first album. So what we're going to start with today is we're going to take two tunes. We'll start off with the first two. which are from that very first album, the Please Please Me album. We're going to do a cover version, because they did a lot of covers on that first album, a song called Baby It's You. And then we're going to do a Lennon-McCartney original called Misery. That's our starting point.